Welcome to the Greek New Testament.io podcast with hosts Dennis, Stephen, and Ian. We bring you in-depth grammatical discussions of the Greek New Testament, from verse analysis to syntactical concepts to textual criticism. Our discussion is all based on our joint project to bring a Greek New Testament grammatical commentary to the church. If you have a love for God's Word and hunger for deeper understanding of the grammar of Koine Greek language, this is the podcast for you.
Welcome, viewers and listeners. This is Ian, and I'm joined by Dennis and Stephen. Dennis, do you want to give us a quick introduction to what we're going to be talking about today?
We're going to be talking about menoŭn. Menoŭn is a word which is in Luke in the Nestle-Aland version, but not a Greek word. So we're going to have fun looking at that background.
All right. That sounds like an interesting topic. And just to give a little bit of background on why we're doing this YouTube and podcast is that the three of us have a project that we're jointly working on called the Greek New Testament Grammatical Commentary, which is an interactive functional grammar of the Greek New Testament for the church. And at the heart of it, you'll probably hear us refer to the database that has these different grammatical relationships in the New Testament. And Dennis will be our main teacher today. And as always, we're going to start with a scripture reading from the Greek New Testament. Stephen?
Well, or the verse that has the word that we're looking up today is Luke 11:28, and I'm going to be reading out of the UBS edition, UBS 3 here. So let me read it. This is the word of God. Avtos the ipen, menoŭn, makarii iakuondas ton logon to theou, kephilasondas. Once again, and this is using the modern Greek pronunciation. Avtos the ipen, menoŭn, makarii iakuondas ton logon to theou, kephilasondas.
Okay, would you like to read the English?
Yes. Then he said, "Blessed indeed are those who hear the word of God and keep it."
So let's take a look at the unit diagram. The unit diagram has four verbs: ipen, isin, akuondas, philasondas. And there are four lines. There's one line per unit, per verbal unit. That's the way that this is diagrammed. And you see the indentation here. That means that this line, this unit, is a dependent of this one, and these two units are a dependent of this one. You see the word isin is in italics. That means, like in the King James, it's not actually there. It's an elliptic. It's there elliptically because menoŭn makarii is a clause, and a clause is headed by a verb. One other thing to note there is that there are two red words, menoŭngia and menoŭn. The menoŭn is the one that's in the Nestle-Aland, and the menoŭngia is the one that's in the Byzantine. So we're going to talk about that some more, but the theme of this podcast is menoŭn and menoŭngia. So there are three other verses that have menoŭngia in the Greek New Testament, and we're going to look at those. Pastor, would you read Romans 9:20?
Yes, I'd be happy to. O anthropa, menoŭnga, CTC o andapokrinomenos to theo, mia rito plasma to plasondi, time pisas utos. I'll read it one more time. O anthropa, menoŭnga, CTC o andapokrinomenos to theo, mia rito plasma to plasondi, time pisas utos.
All right, and the translation.
Yes, on the contrary, O man, who are you to answer God? The clay does not say to the potter, "Why have you made me this way?" does it?
So up at the top, you'll see in brackets, you'll see the Byzantine, and the Byzantine word is the same as the Greek, the two red words. However, there's a transposition in the Byzantine. Menoŭngia comes first and o anthropa comes second. Okay, we'll tuck that away. That's very important as far as postpositive order is concerned, and we'll get back to it. Can you read Romans 10:18, please?
I'd be happy to. Ala lego, miuk ikusan, mενοῦν εις πάσαν την γην εξήλθεν ο φέγγος αυτόν, και εις τα θέρατα της οικουμένης τα ρήματα αυτών. Once again, αλλά λέγω, μη ουκ ήκουσαν μενοῦν εις πάσαν την γην εξήλθεν ο φέγγος αυτόν, και εις τα θέρατα της οικουμένης τα ρήματα αυτών. But I say, they did not fail to hear, did they? On the contrary, their voice has gone out into all the world.
What you see on the screen is just the first clause. In this particular case, the Byzantine and the Nestle-Aland are identical. All right, let's move on to the final instance of this mενοῦν, and it's in Philippians 3:8.
Αλλά μενοῦν και ηγούμε πάντα ζημίαν, είναι δια του υπερέχον της γνώσεως Χριστού Ιησού του Κυρίου μου. Once again, αλλά μενοῦν και ηγούμε πάντα ζημίαν, είναι δια του υπερέχον της γνώσεως Χριστού Ιησού του Κυρίου μου. But indeed, I even consider all things to be loss on account of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord.
All right, let's look at the bottom, and this is a summary of the claim of Greek commentary. The claim is that the Nestle-Aland United Bible Society compound mενοῦν in Luke 11 is not a Greek word. It should be postpositive mενοῦν. Now you can see up there in 11:28, Luke 11:28, that mενοῦν is in the Byzantine and it's different in the Nestle-Aland. But this claim is not that the Byzantine should be preferred over the Alexandrian in the Nestle-Aland. The claim is that the NU, the Nestle-Aland mενοῦν, is not a legitimate compound of men. It's not in the original Luke, and it violates the absolute postpositive prohibition against the initial position. Grammatical commentary advocates that the absolute grammar rules should form part of the selection criteria for determining the original text. So if some set of criteria for the critical text for originality results in a speech pattern that Greek speakers never exhibited but frequently rejected, then those criteria are inadequate to determine the originality, and they need to be supplemented by some grammatical considerations. Of course, Semiticisms could possibly bypass those rules, but men is classical. So let me just reiterate what the point is here. We're not saying that the critical text didn't follow its criteria. What we're saying is the Nestle-Aland criteria are not sufficient. They need to be supplemented with some grammatical considerations. Otherwise, you can steer off into the never land. Mενοῦν is a word that's always been in Greek. It's in Plato. Interestingly, in Plato, it was in Crito, which was a treatise about justification, about δικαιοσύνη. And you can see that the places where it's legitimate are in Romans there, the two places in Romans, which is a treatise about δικαιοσύνη. So, of course, Paul was a literary person and was trained in both Hebrew and Greek. And so this word would be there. But what I'm saying is there is no word mενοῦν. There's no such word.
That is radical.
It's pretty radical because we're not only claiming that there's no such word, we're claiming that the criteria for originality selection need to be supplemented with some grammatical considerations. So that being radical, we're going to have to deal with why the rules for selection are so ingrained. It's the ingrained irrational prejudice of modern educated people tends to reject absolute rules, like absolute grammar rules. So the job of grammatical commentary is to show the advantage of switching to objective statistical evidence for such absolute rules from this irrational degenerate programming that we're faced with in postmodernism. So the evidence is rather detailed for this, and there's a little logical complexity in this podcast, and anybody that's bored with detailed evidence should skip the podcast.
Okay.
So this is just a review. We're not getting into it yet. This is just a review of postpositive men. What does that mean? Postpositive conjunction men occurs 179 times in the Nestle-Aland New Testament, and it's always in the postpositive position. There's not a single exception. Postpositive means coming second or sometimes third, but not first in the matrix. It never comes first. And what is the matrix? The matrix is the phrase of the head of the postpositive. In this case, it's always a clause because menoun and menounya, they modify the clausal head. So when we say matrix, we're talking about the clause. And if you look, let me show you up here, menoun is in the clause of isin, and it's first. Down here, menoun is in the clause of exalthine, and it's first. Now here, over here, you can see that menoun is second in Philippians. That's why the Byzantine has menoun instead of menounya, because menoun is postpositive, but menounya is not. And interestingly, up here in Romans 9:20, you can see that menounya is also second, which would be a postpositive position. However, in the Byzantine, it's first. So that's the complexity of menounya and the postpositive, how you tell whether it's postpositive. The question of postpositive is postpositive in what? And it's a clause. So there are only 10 postpositives in the Greek New Testament. The, yar, ya, men, mendi, un, pu, pos, and ta. The four of them that don't have accents are enclitics. The thing to note, the syntactical fact about men, is that it always refers to the first item in a list involving contrast. To supplement that, men is often accomplished by proton first. So the normal men construction correlates with the, men, the. And the that indicates the second or subsequent items. And here's an example from the Bible. Omen ekaton, o the exikonda, o the triakonda. The 100, another 60, another 30. However, occasionally a marker other than that indicates the subsequent items. Now, some grammarians think that such a men without the explicit correlated the is reduced to indeed. But actually, the contrasts can always be found. If the that is missing, it's still a coordination, but it's like an asyndeton coordination. This is how it's used. The men construction is a kind of coordinate construction. It's something like both in front of the ordinary coordinate construction pointing to the first conjunct. And here's an example. Ponirus teka agathus. Both bad and good. You can see that the ta in there is like the men. It's a postpositive and it refers to the first conjunct, and then the ka refers to the second conjunct. So men is a marker signaling an upcoming list. However, it's markedly looser than the ordinary coordinate construction in that the list items do not need to be parallel in function, and they do not need to be siblings belonging to the same head. There is an exact correspondence between the English coordinate construction and the Greek, but English doesn't have any exact correspondence to men. Now we're going to look at the compounds of men. We just talked about men as a separate word so far. Until the 9th century, the reason we're talking about it, if you look up in the top, menoun up in Luke 11:8 is a compound of two postpositives. The compound means that there's no space between it. If there's a space between it, it's not a compound. So until the 9th century, Byzantine minuscules, there were no compound lexemes. Greek did not set lexemes apart with spaces in the uncials. At the time of the Alexandrian text, there were no compounds. For example, menti is a compound, but it could be considered one or two words. It doesn't matter. It's still always postpositive. Can't put menti in position one in the clause. However, Greek had a single exception that permitted men in the initial position, and that was if it was followed by un ya. Plato used it that way, as we mentioned earlier. No compound that ends in ya is postpositive. No separate word before the separate postpositive ya is postpositive. So ya is a switch for the hearer. It's a signal for the hearer to turn off a feature. Yeah, whether compounded or not, operates as an unpostpositivizer switch in menoŭn. That means it allows men to be first if it's in this sequence. It's kind of tricky, but it's actually not that hard for a person to understand. Now we're going to circle back to the connection between menoŭn and text criticism. The claim is impossible Greek cannot be original. The initial menoun or menoun, whether compounded or not, is impossible Greek. It violates the absolute rule of postpositives unless overridden by the yes switch. Impossible Greek cannot be original. Therefore, Luke did not write menoun or menoun compounded in the initial position in Luke 11:28. The only way that menoun or menoun could go there is if it were followed by yeah. The Byzantine and Beze and Ephraimi Rescriptus also have menoŭn. Grammatical commentary is not arguing that menoŭn is right because it is Byzantine. Grammatical commentary is arguing that menoŭn is right because that's the only grammatical way to put menoun in the initial position. So since the hapax, menoun as a compound word, is not a legitimate or original Greek word in Luke 11:28, it's not a real word and it doesn't belong in a lexicon. Of course, the idea that this is an absolute rule will appear foreign and unbelievable to a lot of people. The only reason that it appears foreign and unbelievable is because of habit and authority. Instead, grammatical commentary doesn't go by habit and authority, it goes by evidence. The broader Greek community does not consider initial menoun or compound menoun to be legitimate. They do not consider menoun a real Greek word. It appears nowhere outside the critical text in Luke 11:28. It's not in the strong numbers. Bauer finds no precedence for it. This sequence never occurs in the papyri in the initial position. No one has found any evidence that such a word sequence ever existed outside the Alexandrian manuscripts. In contrast, the postpositive sequence, menoun, occurs 39 times in the Greek New Testament. And it also occurs in the Septuagint, and it always occurs in the postpositive position without the yeah. So the Greek usage in the Greek New Testament presents a very crisp picture of the menoun position. It's initial if it's followed by yeah, but it's postpositive if it's not followed by yeah. So by this simple test, NU has also made a mistake in Romans 9:20 and Philippians 3. Let's review that. 9:20, menoun is in the second position. But we've just seen that menoun only goes in the first position. In Philippians here, menoun is just in the second position again, and it should go in the first position. So the Byzantine corrects it in two different ways. In Philippians, the Byzantine leaves the order the same, but it puts in menoun instead of menoun. Up here, it does the other option, and it switches the order of these two words, of o anthropa and menoun, so that once again in the Byzantine, menoun is first. This leads us to an explanation of what happened in Luke 11:28. The simplest solution is that some Alexandrian copyist shortened menoun to menoun in Luke 11:28. Now, this doesn't square with the critical text claim because they claim it's original and it was lengthened in the Byzantine. So the immediate question that is naturally asked is this just speculation? No, it isn't actually. There's a lot of evidence for it, and we'll go through that. We know that the Alexandrian scribes were shorteners because different Alexandrian manuscripts shortened in different places. And the Nestle-Aland editors ignore the shorter reading when they find them, if there are more Alexandrian readings that are longer. According to the NU editors, the Vaticanus scribe shortened the menoun to menoun in Romans. The Vatican scribe scrubbed off the off from that. Why did the Vatican scribe do that? Well, it's because it's in the second position, and the Vatican scribe knew that you can't put menungia in the second position, in the postpositive position. But the critical text ignored that witness. Vaticanus did it in Philippians too, here. Now this time it was appropriate. So this right here is the Nestle-Aland with menungia, but the Vaticanus, their favorite one, has menoun without the ya. Critical text principles are a vote. They look at the other Alexandrian texts, and more of the Alexandrian texts had the ya than the un, so they ignored the menoun witness from their favorite text, the Vaticanus. So we're not saying that they violated their own principles. We're just saying that their own principles are inadequate. They're not taking into consideration the reality of Greek. And if their principles result in impossible Greek, then they've got to look back at what's real Greek. The original wasn't written in impossible Greek. So the Alexandrian shortening of menungia in Romans and Philippians to menoun is asserted by NU editors themselves in the apparatus. But that might not be what actually happened. As we look there, probably in Philippians, Vaticanus did not shorten it. Vaticanus was just producing the real original. Okay, the shortened versions would be the correct versions, not shortened in these two versions. So according to the absolute postpositive rule, Vaticanus text was grammatical and the NU text is not. So this is a continuation of the Alexandrian shorteners. Is it true that NU editors always follow their own sources? No, it's not. The Alexandrian scribes were phonetic spellers with frequent errors, and if a majority of the Alexandrian manuscripts spelled something wrong, NU corrects it anyway. They want them to look unpolished but not uncouth. And actually, this is a good plan because there's nothing inspired about spelling, and it's better to spell the thing correctly anyway. So the conclusion here is that textual critics are not any more bound to follow absolute grammatical mistakes slavishly than they are spelling mistakes. They shouldn't want their sources to look grammatically false either. They should use our knowledge of grammar to guide selection just as they do the spelling conventions. Now we come to the critical juncture. Is this really an absolute rule? This is the thing that sticks in the craw of most postmoderns. Postmoderns are almost incapable of believing that there are any absolute rules, so all of this is irrelevant to them anyway. But we're going to look at the evidence. We want you to think in terms of evidence rather than authority. There are 1,757 pairs of uninflected words containing at least one postpositive in the Greek New Testament. And none of these sequences is ever compounded except menoun. And it's compounded in menoun ya, but it's also compounded by Nestle-Aland in the word menoun. So you can see that it's very unusual to do that, and there has to be a reason. We've seen the reason in menoun ya. It's got a precedent in classical Greek, but we don't see the reason in menoun. So another statistic is there are 918 pairs of uninflected words in the Greek New Testament starting with the postpositive other than menoun. They're all postpositive. Not a single one of those starts in any position other than the postpositive position. So the odds against a pair of lexemes with initial postpositive other than menoun becoming initial are 918 to 0. This is in the coded section. So this is an absolute postpositive grammatical rule, and it's independent of coding. So we're going to look at another statistic. Postpositive men occurs 179 times, and it's never in the initial position. In the coded sentences, it's in a maximum of position 3. So it's either 2 or 3, never anything else, no variations. Men occurs in position number 2 of the sentence 62 times, but never in position 1. And you don't even need any syntax coding to show this. It shows up right away without coding. Okay, here's another statistic. There are 1,351 postpositives in the sample. The sample is the part that's been completed by grammatical commentary, and not one of them is in the initial position. So that increases the odds to 1,351 to 0. Now we expand the sample and include all postpositives in the GNT, not just men and not just the coded ones. There are 4,786 of them. None of them appears as the first word in the sentence. And over half of them you can see appear as the second word in the sentence. This is easily shown in any search that doesn't have the syntax coding even done. No syntax coding is needed to prove this. So the odds are 4,786 to 0 against the initial postpositive. These odds are statistically significant, overwhelmingly so, and they're so significant that not even the Nestle-Aland editors dared to challenge the absolute postpositive rule without attempting to conceal this fact. And their followers shouldn't rely on the idea that rules are not absolute either. Why don't the Nestle-Aland editors dare to claim this is not an absolute rule? They know better. That postpositives never came first in the matrix is an absolute rule. And the phony compound menoŭn is a tacit admission of this absolute rule so that they can avoid putting a separate word men in the initial position. That's why they compounded it in an illegitimate way. Getting back to the editing rules, when you drop Humpty on the floor and your robot puts him back together in such a way that the head is attached to the foot, then you know that you need to reprogram the robot. Here's the conclusion. The conclusion is that Luke 11:28 had mενοῦν as the original, not mενοῦν. And the alleged non-postpositive compound mενοῦν is not even a Greek word, and it shouldn't be in the lexicon. This conclusion, NU got mενοῦν wrong in Romans 9:20 and Philippians 5:8. These conclusions, they're based on the rules of compounding and on the function of the yes switch in turning off the postpositive feature of the individual component. They're not based on the Byzantine text. The final conclusion is that textual criticism needs to run the results of the process by a grammar checker because the original can't be impossible Greek. The standard critical text rebuttal to this evidentiary conclusion is that people's opinion about grammatical correctness is not a legitimate selection criteria for originality, and witnesses should speak for themselves, and that the later scribes regularized the original, which was rougher and more like the Alexandrian in a critical text. However, this is not Nestle-Aland's response. So anybody that's taking this response, these talking points, is not following the Nestle-Aland response. Nestle-Aland does not contest the absoluteness of the postpositive rule. On the contrary, they always follow it. We saw those 4,000 instances where they follow it. No postpositive in NU ever goes in the initial position. Remember, I read you the 10 postpositives, and those postpositives occur 4,000 or 5,000 times, and they never go in the initial position. So the phony compounding of mενοῦν is done. It's designed precisely to avoid putting the postpositive men as a separate word in the initial position. Why is mενοῦν phony? Because mενοῦν, as two separate words, is the regular form, and no other pair of lexemes is ever written both compounded and uncompounded in the Greek text. Now that's maybe a shocking claim, but it's true. The ot is an example that people think of sometimes. Ot may be written either compounded or uncompounded, but this is not the rule that we're talking about. We're talking about two lexemes, and o and t are not lexemes, they're inflections. So this rule with the 4,000, this refers to actual lexemes. The editorial policy for compounds is a consistent either or. Either two words, two lexemes are always compounded or they're never compounded. There's no compromise where it goes one way. Compounding lexemes does not change syntax, it reflects syntax. But let's look at the NU idea that mενοῦν can be postpositive if compounded, but non-postpositive if compounded. It's like a child thinking that people cannot see what he is doing if he covers his eyes. And he gets others to pretend this too. In the real life, compounding has nothing to do with it. They've compounded it as if compounding had something to do with where you could be postpositive or not. but compounding has nothing to do with it. Menounga is compounded, but that does not cause it to be postpositive. So in contrast, menounga, or a word like tigarun, which is a compound of gar and un, they're always non-postpositive. And mendi is always postpositive. They don't go back and forth. The idea here is that expressions have predictable, consistent behavior, syntax, which is required for communication. The goal of the grammar is to discover it. Why would you posit a hypothesis like that? Well, it's because the hearer has to have the same conventions as the speaker, and the hearer has to know what the speaker means, and the speaker has to have signals that the hearer expects. This is part of language theory. So in conclusion, if Nestle-Aland were to correct this editorial compounding error and write menoun, which is the suggestion that a person would think, well, why, if the menoun isn't a word, why don't you just write it separately? They can't do that. If they did that, they would either have to admit that they made a critical text error in Luke and put a postpositive sequence in a non-postpositive position, or they would have to admit that Luke himself put men in the initial position. That's where logic boxes rationalizers in. But the editors are loath to admit either alternative. They're in an uncomfortable logical box, and they have attempted an Orwellian vocabulary strategy of playing word games to hide the fact of what they have done. It's impossible for a lexeme to be semi-postpositive generally, but there is one case. It's the case of on. Semi-postpositive would be postpositive in some contexts and not postpositive in others. The case of on can mean if or ever. If it's if, it goes in front of the clause, and if it's ever, it follows immediately after the word that it modifies. On is given as a postpositive in some lists. It goes in compounds, but it's not a compound. There are quite a few compounds like aon. There are precise syntactical conditions that switch the semantics and postpositive status of on off and on. However, menoun lacks any such statistical conditions. There's lots of cases of both kinds of on in the literature, and they always have the same conditions, switching the postpositive condition off and on. Compounding is an editorial decision, not a syntactical condition, but compounding may not override the grammatical rule that a sequence of lexemes may not be both postpositive and initial. There is no semi-postpositive compound. On is a single word, but it's not a compound. There's no postpositive menunya. This addresses the line of rebuttal that scribes corrected, and the initial doesn't have to follow the grammar rules. That line doesn't hold water either, because the definition of regular that NU violates in these verses comes from the statistical postpositive patterns of the Alexandrian text itself. Alexandrian text is 100% consistent on postpositives. The rule doesn't come from the post-Alexandrian scribes or any rules or any corrections that they might have imposed. The fact that the Byzantine manuscripts got it right when some Alexandrian scribes did not is not part of the argument that we are making. It's just an observation. The idea that's presented in the rebuttal is fallacious response, logically fallacious, and it's classified as a red herring. Really, we're based, if we're logical rather than based on authority, if we're evidentiary and objective, the choice is between rhetoric and statistical objectivity. So circling back, it's hard for self-confident, educated, degenerate postmoderns to overcome their programming that there are no absolute rules, which they unthinkingly consider self-evident. But many rules of physics and grammar are actually absolute. It doesn't follow that just because many rules are sometimes violated, that all rules are sometimes violated. For example, no educated person or street gang member or foreigner ever says church the in English conversation. The order of the article is absolute. It's indelibly ingrained in every baby or novice, and so is the postpositive order in the GNT. It's not one of those kinds of grammatical mistakes that uneducated people could make. Why is that? Language is in our DNA. We were created in the image of Logos, which is ordered speech. So instead of pretending that there are no absolute rules, the honest question is, what does the evidence show? Does it validate absolute rules with statistical significance? If Greek speakers did not talk that way, then it's not original no matter what the text-critical principles that were chosen show. Many educated people look down their noses at statistical evidence and counter it with talking points that people misuse statistics. However, talking points are not evidence, no matter how brilliant or true they are. Christianity, like the Last Judgment, is based on tests. God's universe is testable, and that's why statistical research into grammatical knowledge is feasible, it not to be scoffed at. When evidence counters no evidence, the only time that those with no evidence think they win is if they are led by the deceiver. Any of you who challenge the statistical evidence must ask yourself first, not what your talking points are, but what your counter evidence is. The disrespect of evidentiary tests is preference for sound bites is really sick, even if it's educated. Honesty and empirical objectivity in establishing grammatical rules requires a certain feature. It's called falsifiable claims. So the rule against menoŭn is falsifiable. All that the challenger needs to do is find one example of 2 or 3 consecutive lexemes anywhere in the Greek New Testament, starting with one of the 10 postpositives, that is usually postpositive but sometimes initial. Surely you challengers could find one such example. Then the claim is disproved that we are making here. We're taking a risk. All objective claims need to take a risk. They need to take a risk that somebody's going to find a counterexample. Only one counterexample is needed to disprove an absolute rule. All challengers of this analysis should consider themselves so challenged. Bring it on. Actually, we're willing to learn and modify if the evidence warrants. That's our story.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Dennis, for that analysis and argument. And I want to invite our viewers to check out a new section on our website called Ask Dennis, where we invite you to submit your own grammar, syntax, or even morphological questions to Dennis. And you can get there by visiting GreekNewTestament.io. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the GreekNewTestament.io podcast at www.GreekNewTestament.io.